Hello, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz, President of the City University Graduate Center. Welcome to Women, a program for and about us. I'm delighted that one of our own is able to be with us. Carol Berkin, Professor of American History at CUNY's Baruch College and here at the CUNY Graduate Center. Her latest book, Revolutionary Mothers, Women in the Struggle for America's Independence, has just been published by Alfred A. Knopf, and it gives us a new appreciation of our strengths and our accomplishments. Welcome.
Thank you.
Carol, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, about as far south as you can go without falling into the Gulf of Mexico. And I came to New York at 16 and a half to go to college and never left.
And where'd you went to
Went
Barnard?
to Barnard College,
And
yes.
did you know then you wanted to be an historian?
Oh, absolutely not. I had a history teacher in high school for whom all of human history was the coming of the Civil War, and which was the war for northern aggression. And she dictated to us, and the next day we wrote it back, and I said, this is the most boring subject in the world. But when I got to college, I had amazing history teachers who made it come alive, and I said, you get to read other people's mail, you get to time trip and go back in time and go to places that you couldn't physically go, and you get to write, and those were wonderful opportunities for me.
It's amazing how teachers turn students on to fields, isn't it?
I had a fabulous teacher who acted out Napoleon giving medals to his officers and what he imagined that he whispered in their ear. And I said, real people, interesting stories, sin, sex, revenge, murder, heroics. How could you not want to be a historian?
But you decided to be an American historian?
Yes. I became very interested in colonial America. It's one of the strange things. I have no explanation for why, as my family came over in the 20th century, but there was something about that period that really called out to me, the 17th and 18th century, and so that's what I decided to do.
And you pursued that in the doctoral program at Columbia?
At Columbia, that's right.
And you stayed in New York ever since?
Ever since. I am worried I have to renew my passport if I leave Manhattan, so.
Why this book, Revolutionary Mothers?
I have been talking and writing and teaching about this subject for about, I think, since 1972, when American Airlines asked me to write a piece in their magazine that goes in the little slot in front of your seat about women in the Revolution. And I think I wrote the book because my children were so tired of hearing me talk about these women. They said, write it down, Mom. And so when I got the opportunity, really it sort of came pouring out because I had been thinking about this for so long. And
where do you get the materials for this kind of a book?
When we first started doing early American women's history, people said, oh, you'll never find anything. You won't find any documents. There are no letters. There are no diaries. There are no... And as it turns out, actually, there's an enormous wealth of material. It just used to be cataloged wrong. You would see a man's papers, and then it would say miscellaneous papers. And in that would be the wife's diary. And so part of finding this material is just knowing not to say okay when someone says we don't have the papers. To say, no, I bet you do. They're in family papers, or they're in miscellaneous papers, or other newspapers, and the enormous revolution in women's history produced books, journals that have been edited and published. And so a lot of this material really has come available in the last 10 years. And I have been collecting it, really, I hate to say since 1972, people will know I'm old. I'll say I started when I was 6. I've been collecting poems and stories and diary entries and letters. And friends, when I wrote this book, friends in the field, were just wonderful about sending me material too.
Well, we know, for instance, that Abigail Adams was a great letter writer.
Yes.
And luckily we have many of her letters.
Yes.
But other women?
Oh, absolutely. Mercy Otis Warren, Judith Sargent Murray, who published those Gleaner essays.
Mercy Otis Warren was, you said, the top propagandist
Absolutely.
in Boston?
She was the major newspaper propagandist in all the years before the war. She wrote plays that made fun of British policy and supporters of British policy. And when she would pause, John Adams would send her a note and say, start writing again. And she would feign, of course they were all published anonymously because women weren't supposed to do this. She would say, I don't know what you're talking about. But of course she did. And she was critical in really creating the radical movement in Boston, often not mentioned in many history books.
But she wrote anonymously. How does one find out that in fact
you find the manuscripts in her papers, and you do analysis. People have done analysis of the writing style with the 3-volume history of the American Revolution she published under her own name after the Revolution. And so we know she wrote them. We know from John Adams she wrote them. They're wonderful, sarcastic, satiric plays with all the heroes on the radical side are named Brutus and Mark Antony, and all the people on the other side are named Brigadier Haydall. So they're just great pieces of propaganda.
You decided to organize this book in a very interesting way. And you start out with the Loyalists, the people who were pro the British. And the stresses and strains, even within families, where a husband was with the colonialists, the Americans, and the wife was with the Loyalists, or vice versa.
Well, very few wives dared to openly challenge which side their husband took. What normally happened for these poor women who were Loyalists is that their whole family, their brothers, their cousins, their mother, their father, would be patriots. And her husband would be a Loyalist. Esther Sewell, who was the wife of a man who I wrote my first book about. Jonathan Sewell. A poor woman, her husband took her into exile, and her sister was married to John Hancock. So the split from her whole family was just devastating. But very few wives challenged that their place was beside their husband, even if they had different views. As soon as Esther Sewell's husband dies, she hightails it back to Boston. She moves back home where she really wanted to be. But I organized the book in such a way that what I wanted to show was the revolution was many different revolutions to different people. That to Native American women, freedom and independence meant something completely different than it did to Abigail Adams, and in fact set these women against Abigail Adams. That for African American women, freedom and liberty meant opposing the very men who had declared, give me liberty or give me death. That for patriot women it was one war, for Loyalist women it was another. And I really wanted to show how complicated the revolution was.
Well, you really succeed, especially in the description of what the so-called home front, though there really wasn't a home front because the war was potentially in every community.
Absolutely.
But the kinds of adaptations that the women left behind had to make.
Yes. You read these enormous books about the American Revolution and women aren't mentioned, which gets my dander up. And I think there are only two possibilities. Here this war is being fought right in the street in your town. It's being fought in your farmyard. It's being fought in your house because someone is commandeering your house. Women didn't notice that the war was going on. I mean, was there massive catatonic state among women? And so I thought we really ought to show what a home front war, and I think to some extent Vietnam and other wars that have been home front wars for other people, attuned us to this idea that Here were women who had to manage the farms or the businesses while they still did their own tasks. In the midst of inflation, scarcity of goods, this was no easy task for them. They were spies, they were messengers. They burned their own house down so the British or the American troops couldn't use it as a place to stay.
That is amazing, that they would burn their own homes to stave off the British using their homes.
Absolutely. Catherine Schuyler in upstate New York burns the entire wheat crop. And she says, I'd rather have it destroyed than have Burgoyne and his army gain this food. And so you have people being drawn into wartime effort, whether they wanted to be or not, and managing, opening their homes to the wounded, hiding spies, hiding caches of arms for the patriots, risking their life, really, in many cases. Parts of spy rings where women were put in on prison ships if they were caught, if they were arrested by the British. And so you had this incredible people's war that I really wanted to convey what it was like for these women when armies were marching back and forth across their land.
Well, you know, it's interesting reading this book because, as you say, the Revolutionary War has been written about all the men and the armies. And what you succeed in doing is really making the reader feel that one is living in those communities that are so besieged and afraid and afflicted. And the fact that you used women's voices to make this happen, it's quite an achievement.
Well, thank you, thank you. I thought it was one way for people to see. I wanted to write about women because that's my field, but I also thought it was one way for people to de-romanticize the American Revolution and see, like the Civil War, what it's like when war comes really to your own backyard, and how frightening it is, how frightening it was for some of these women. Liza Wilkinson, who really in her normal life was a feisty woman, her home is invaded 3 times. And she writes and she says, "It seems to me all the world is nothing but tragedy and disaster, and no one is spared." And so from her words, you get a feeling of what it was like to have everything taken from you by people who had once been your neighbors. It must have been such a horrible experience for all of these women to go through.
In many ways, it was almost a civil war in that it pitted Americans against Americans.
Absolutely.
In terms of where their loyalties lay.
So much so in the South, where the backcountry farmers were almost to a person loyalists because they so hated those Tidewater planters who were, I mean, there's so much irony in it. The Tidewater planters are screaming no taxation without representation, and they're doing exactly that to the backcountry farmers. They're refusing to let them have a voice in the assembly. And there, the warfare is unbelievably brutal. The atrocities between American colonists and American colonists, I mean, there are accounts of pregnant women being slit open, rape, murder of children. It is so vicious that even when I began to really get deeper into this, even I was sort of stunned by the degree to which this was an all-out battle of hatred between these two groups. And when Loyalist troops in the South fought with the British Army, no one gave any quarter. If the Patriots won the battle, they killed all the wounded. If the Loyalists won the battle, they killed all the wounded Patriots. I mean, there's real, I think, even more hostility than in the Civil War between the Northern and the Southern troops.
You tell some very interesting stories. You debunk the notion that there was a Molly pitcher.
This is the point at which my children used to put their hands over their ears every time we would drive on the New Jersey Turnpike. When we hit the Molly Pitcher rest stop, I would start, there was no, my children would go, we know, there was no person named Molly Pitcher. This was a term like Rosie the Riveter in World War II that was given for all the women in the forts who would carry pitchers of water. Molly was a very common colonial name, and pitcher was for the pitchers of water that they carried, not for the soldiers, but to cool down the cannon, so that the soldiers could reach in and reload the cannon after they had fired it. And so after you'd fired a cannon, one of the cannoneers would shout out, Molly Pitcher, and a woman would come running with the water, and often they were wounded, they were hit by cannonballs, and if the cannoneer, I think that's a term for the person who fires the cannon, were wounded, these women took over. And so that famous picture of supposedly Molly Pitcher loading the cannon is a true depiction of what women did, even though there was no person named Molly Pitcher. The woman most commonly described as a Molly Pitcher was Mary Ludwig Hayes, who was 8 months pregnant when she was loading that cannon. And so it demeans the role women played to think that there was just one person who did this. So I wanted everybody to know hundreds of women did this.
Well, your depiction of the women who followed the army, the camp followers, was in interesting contrast to the women who were the wives of the generals and the way they were treated.
I did this on purpose. Put those two chapters next to each other because I wanted readers to know also that this was a period of social class distinctions. And so the wives of George Washington and General Greene and General Knox were put up in homes. They came with their servants and their slaves. And though they didn't live as well as they did in peacetime, they lived quite well. The soldiers' wives who followed the army led very difficult lives. They were given half rations. Their children were not well taken care of. They had to work for their keep. And the distinction between these two sets of camp followers, I think, told you something about the class system in colonial society.
Yet Martha Washington comes through as a very admirable character that she didn't have to do all the things she did.
She is, both of them went up so much in my estimation the more I study them. She did not want to go to the army camp. She was a real homebody. She wanted to stay home where she was, surrounded by relatives and friends. She was a very unassuming woman. But when George said, I want you to join me, every single winter of the war, she traveled. And what's so charming about her is she's always so surprised that people greet her like a celebrity. And when she arrives in Philadelphia the first time and they have a big feast for her and a party, and she writes home and she says, I was greeted as if I was somebody. And I think that there's something so level-headed about her. And her presence in the camp meant a lot to the men. It was a real morale booster that even General Washington's wife was willing to make sacrifices to come. And she dressed very plainly, and she was always knitting for the officers and the soldiers. And women would come to call on her who didn't know her, all dressed up in their finery, and they would be very surprised to find her just a very down-to-earth person.
And the story you tell about Deborah Champion.
Yes.
Who really is up there with Paul Revere.
Yes.
And yet, this is the first I ever heard of her.
Deborah Champion, Sybil Luddington, in Putnam County, they refer to her as the female Paul Revere, and I think, well, Paul Revere ought to be called the male Sybil Luddington, because he was captured 5 seconds after he started his ride. Sybil Luddington rode through Putnam County in the middle of the night to call out the militia for her father, and she finished her ride. And Deborah Champion carries this message from one general to Washington and Boston, and she's captured, and she cleverly escapes, and she almost is captured when she stays at this inn, and she climbs out the window and escapes. I mean, and she's a young girl.
And she brought important information
to Washington. Emily Geiger was about 14 years old, and she brings messages between two Southern patriot generals. It's absolutely critical. And these girls risk their lives, and they're not household names. I think they ought to be, they're household names in my household, but they really ought to be known. They play critical roles in major military campaigns.
And the story you tell about the Native Americans, the American Indians, and the conflict that they had in terms of which side to join. And most of them, from your account, joined the Loyalists?
Joined the British, absolutely. It was the best of two bad choices. Americans, the colonists, were land grabbers. And it's the only nice way to put it. Our whole history is a history of taking land until we get to the Pacific Ocean. And the colonists were just unbelievably crass about cheating Native Americans, killing Native Americans to get the land. And the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Mohawk, they understood that while the British weren't as good as the French, the British were better than the Americans. That if the Americans won the war, there would be a tremendous loss for the Native Americans. And so most of the Iroquois Confederation side with the British, and largely because of a woman, because of Molly Brant, who keeps these tribes from splitting apart and from siding with the Americans. And at one point, the diplomat to the Native Americans says in a letter, if you want to get anything done, don't bother with the men. Go to Molly Brant. She's the one who will make the decision.
Well, one of the things I really learned from this book is the equality within the Native American culture at that time. You know, the men hunted and the women farmed.
Yes, and they controlled the steady food supply, so they had a role to play. They were able to tell the men, if you want to go to war, fine, but you're not taking any food with you. And so they had great influence. Molly Brant, Nancy Ward, Queen Esther were all military leaders as well. And the real tragedy, I think, for Native American women in these tribes was that if after the war they wanted to stay in American territory, they were forced to adopt English gender roles, which put them in the household and dependent on their husbands.
You have a passage in here of when the treaties were agreed to. Nanye, who is Molly Brant, instructed John Sevier to take the treaty back to the women of his tribe for ratification, for she said the women must hear our words. And Sevier was dumbstruck because in his world, women played no role in political and diplomatic affairs, and she couldn't understand that.
That's right. That's right. And in that one statement, the women must hear our words. They have to make the decision about the treaty as well as the men. And his, what are you talking about, is the world of difference in gender roles in these two groups. And what happens afterwards is these women are forced, really, the tribes are forced, like the Seneca, are forced to adopt what the Americans called civilized gender roles.
But you know, I was reminded of the parallel of the role that women played during the American Revolution, and then after the war, sort of everybody went back to their gender roles. It's sort of like what happened after the Second World War.
Of course. But you know, even after the Second World War, there were changes that my students all think if it doesn't happen within 6 months, there's no impact. But you know, history is long, And so if something has an impact 70 years later, it really has had an impact. You have to have a longer view. After World War I, every of the women was sent home, but women went into the white collar, into the office workplace, and never left that. And so there was an impact of World War II. And the American Revolution, everybody wanted life to go back to the way it was before the war. Even the women, they wanted to rebuild the farms. They didn't want any more radical change. And yet, after the war, a big change took place. And they said women should educate their sons. First time in the history of Anglo-American history that women were given the job of educating their sons and training them to be good patriots. And to do that, they said women have to be educated. And so they opened these young ladies' academies that trained women for the first time, gave them formal education. And most of us who work in this field believe that that's what led, directly though slowly, to Seneca Falls in the first women's movement.
Well, it's a very interesting book. I really recommend it.
Thank you.
Because it gives you a perspective on the American Revolution that otherwise one does not have. And I'm sorry that we're out of time. My thanks to Carol Berkin, Professor of American History here at the Graduate Center and at Baruch College, for joining us. Revolutionary Mothers, Women in the Struggle for America's Independence has just been published by Alfred A. Knopf. For the City University Graduate Center and Women to Women, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz.